to start the afternoon off, we have not only the chair of this conference, but also a pioneer of the smartphone and the chair of the London Futurists organization. So let's give a big hand of welcome to our leader here, David Wood.
So as I was doing some research for this, looking at possible predictions of the future, I clicked on that knowledge base of all wisdom called Facebook. I think my mind was wandering for a few moments, and I saw this article linked by Facebook. A bit of a miserable, small-minded article in some ways. The biggest bullshit job titles in tech. Digital prophet at AOL. Fashion evangelist at Tumblr. Anybody want any of these job titles? Entrepreneur in residence at The Atlantic. I thought that was a good job title. Hacker in residence at LinkedIn. Chief curator at eBay. And maybe my favorite, chief happiness officer at Delivering Happiness. But you might guess what's coming next. Another bullshit job title, according to this Wally Wag. Anyone who self-describes as a futurist. Which is barely even a word, let alone a job. So I've had futurist on my job card since February 2009. So I was amused at this article. But it's clear that the general public, or at least some of the general public, is bemused at the activity of futurists. And indeed, some people are saying, we shouldn't be futurists, we should be nowists. You know, we should be living in the now instead of thinking about the future. But the task of futurists is to consider predictions. Consider predictions of possible futures ahead. Not because we want to be proven right. We're not saying this is going to happen in this date, and when it happens, I'll prove that I'm clever. That's not the purpose of futurists at all. It is to be aware in good time of the threats that lie ahead of us, threats which might come at us more quickly than we expect. It's also to be aware of the opportunities which are out there, if only we grasp them before they move away outside our grasp. So that is the task of futurists, not necessarily to predict a single line of what might happen. But, of course, prediction is hard, and is getting harder. The one reason it's getting harder is because the rate of pace of change is increasing. There are more people creating new technologies. There are social structures which are changing faster. There are ideas rocketing around the world at great pace. And as Eamon Twyman earlier this morning said, we have a complex convergence not just of technologies and risks. So this means it's even harder for us who consider ourselves to be futurists to talk with any confidence about the future. But we must do it. We need to get better at it collectively, because there are still some tremendous threats out there in the not too distant future, and there are opportunities which we will miss if we are not nimble enough and aggressive enough. Now here's my big picture of the future, which some of you have seen a bit of in my opening remarks in the morning. I do think that the future is determined by a sort of a race between up to 4 different trajectories. How fast technology is being developed to address the issues and challenges we have, how quickly some of the societal crises will get worse and may bog us down and may cause all kinds of things that we deeply regret. And then, because the solution to many of these crises is a combination of technology, but also us learning to work together better in terms of a better collaboration. I do believe we know the answers to all the issues we're facing us, but we don't know it in the right place. If only we knew what we knew as society, then brought it back and applied it in a broad enough way, I believe the technology would definitely allow us to solve the crises which many of the speakers have spoken about. And key to this, I do believe personally, is a change in mindset. A change in zeitgeist, a change in philosophy, a change in culture, which I talk about as a transition from humanity 1.0, which sees humanity as sort of constrained, rather weak, noble in some ways, but to a vision of humanity 2.0, a transhumanist vision, where we transcend the original limits of humanity. And the more people who see this as desirable and attractive and something worth putting huge resources into, the more we can collaborate together. So that's my summary. But in this talk, I'm going to look at various predictions, because what I now specialize in, I used to specialize in smartphones and the development of smartphones. I guess what I specialize in these days is giving us confidence in predicting the future. And I want to look at some previous predictions. And I'll start off by a prediction of collaboration. Because we've had many people talking about, yeah, we're going to collaborate more in the future. It's sort of inevitable. So let's look at this prediction here. Predicting collaborating. War between the great powers has become an economic impossibility because of the delicate interdependence of international finance. They're saying it would be a disastrous idea if the great powers would go to war. And let's look at another prediction. The epoch of conquest is over in Europe. It's as certain as anything is in politics that the frontiers of our national states are finally drawn. My own belief is that there will be no more war among the six powers. Were these good predictions? When were they made? This was made in 1910 by Norman Angell, who received a Nobel Prize for his work as to why we should be collaborating. And this other one was made by Henry Noel Brailsford, who investigated something called the Balkan Wars. You know, this Balkan area where there were lots of crises in the lead up in 1914. They were very confident that despite the local difficulties that we're facing, we would be in a new era of collaboration. And I raise this now to make us worry and wonder as well. How secure are we in our confidence that collaboration between the great states will continue? One of the reasons predictions fail, and as we study predictions, it is very much in our interest to understand why past predictions failed when they did, and also why past predictions succeeded when they did. One reason these predictions failed is because there were many connections in Europe at that time that people didn't fully understand and appreciate. This was tied in with this in a way that some people understood, but many others. Also, in related issues, often there are innovations that nobody fully understands. One of the reasons the great powers went to war in 1914 is they all thought it would be a short war. They hadn't realized that innovations in the military fighting equipment meant that it would be bogged down into such a catastrophe. Also, another reason we are wrong in our predictions about the future of peace and prosperity is that we are often unbounded in our overconfidence. We underestimate the weaknesses in human psychology. We underestimate the weaknesses in existing social institutions. We sort of think we're fine. We'll do the rational thing because we're rational beings, but we fail to appreciate the weaknesses there. And the other reason why predictions often fail is because they don't fully account of the systems that are pumped up, taking a life of their own via these positive feedback cycles. And one of the main themes, futurism in my view, is understanding and exploiting positive feedback cycles. Let's look at another failed prediction. Predictions of economic well-being. So this is said 2007, I think, by one of the chief financial officers, somebody who should know a thing or two about finance from AIG, in a Wall Street investor conference call in August 2007. It is hard for us, and without being flippant, to say even a scenario within any kind of realm of reason that would see us losing $1 in any of these credit default swap transactions. Can you say overconfidence? Can you say underestimating the connections between these different financial innovations? Yes. And over here we have Alan Greenspan, the wizard in many ways of financial systems. Those of us who have looked to the self-interest of lending institutions to protect shareholders' equity, myself especially, he said, in a state of shocked disbelief. Failure to appreciate these connections, failures to appreciate the virtual cycles that exist there. Let's look at another prediction. This here, from a company called Nokia, some of you may have heard of. This was Nokia's first mobile phone. I put mobile phone in inverted commas because you had to be quite strong to carry them too far. It weighed 21 pounds, or in new money, that's 10 kilograms. Sometimes people say it didn't matter that the battery life of these devices only lasted 45 minutes because you couldn't carry them for more than 45 minutes. Anyway, They were designed for use in or near cars. Now, the question is, if this is a technology and you were being asked to predict the future for that technology, as indeed a large, credible consulting company called McKinsey was asked to do in the 1980s for AT&T, a major communications company in America, they were asked, well, what's the future of this stuff? Bear in mind, the battery life's going to get better. Bear in mind, probably the voice will get better. So McKinsey said, well, maybe, imagine there might be 900,000 people using these things in the US by 2000. So was that a good prediction? Were they a bit over-optimistic? A bit under-optimistic? There were 109 million, out by 2 orders of magnitude. And again, it's because they had failed to, and the numbers shot up and shot up worldwide. There's as many of these devices as there are now human beings. It is hard to predict the effects of sustained growth. Devices increasingly numerous, lighter, and more useful. But again, lack of really seeing how far these positive, virtuous cycles in technology would go. Now, of course, what's underlying this particular tremendous enhancement in mobile phones is the improvement in computational power, which I've briefly shown in this chart here from a professor at Stanford, Jonathan Koomey, who plots the computations you can get from the best computers of the time, going to things like ENIAC, EDVAC, UNIVAC, more recently Altair, some of the first personal computing, the Apple IIe, all the way up in this to the best laptops in 2008, 2009. How much computation could that computer give you for 1 kilowatt hour of energy in? And it goes up from 1,000 to, what is that? 10 to the 15, I even forget what that's called. It's a very big number, quadrillion perhaps. And it's doubled 40 times, reasonably constantly. Now, it's not an exact straight line, and people like to draw exact straight lines in there, but there's a rough line in there. It had doubled roughly every 18 months. So this is sometimes said to be fulfillment of Moore's law, named after Gordon Moore, who we've heard about several times in this conference, who in 1965 dared to think that the doubling he had observed, it wasn't quite the same. He estimated how many components could be easily integrated, or squashed in, I think he called it, into an integrated circuit. And he noticed that had doubled from about 1959 onwards. He was confident enough initially to say this will probably continue for another 10 years. And Gordon Moore's been at Intel for a long time, and usually when you ask him, well, how much life is there left in your law, he will say, well, I can foresee probably another 10 years, and still to this day. Now, just last year, there was a conference in which there were various leaders of the semiconductor industries. Henry Samuli is the CTO of Broadcom, a major semiconductor manufacturer. He said, well, I can think it's coming to an end. Sometime in the next decade, the 2020s, we won't be able to continue doing this, but we'll still have another 15 years or so ahead of us, so that will take us a long way. This person, at the bottom of the slide, Mike Maybury, who is in charge of the group in Intel, who's responsible for new technologies, for technology and manufacturing, he was more confident. He said, well, in reality, Moore's law is driven not just by one state of technology. They do many developments over the years. They've changed the core technology roughly every 5 or 7 years for the last 40 years. And there's no end in sight for doing that. And he talked about in his group, they are keeping track of 18 different new technologies that might significantly extend the life of that law. So that's a prediction. Is that a good prediction? Because we don't know for sure, because it's a prediction made now. But as I'll emphasize, I think there are good reasons for taking this very seriously. Now, this isn't the only law in town, Moore's law. I'll briefly mention the law named after this person. Why am I showing a grainy photograph of somebody holding a boot to his head in 1972 in New York? This was arguably the first genuine mobile phone call made by Marty Cooper in Motorola. And he was not just the man who happened to be lucky enough to make that call. It took 10 more years before they commercialized the device, by the way. In 1982, Motorola was selling that device first. After 10 more years of development, which shows that some of these things take a long time in incubation. But he was a significant wireless engineer in his own right, and he plotted a different curve. And this shows up from about 1 to 100 to, where are we, 1 trillion conversations per location. It's his way of measuring how good we are at sending information over the wireless spectrum. You have heard of things called 3G. When some of us are lucky enough to run on 4G, LTE, companies are talking about bringing in 5G in 2020, but he tracked it all the way back to long before there was any Gs, all the way to 1895 when Marconi was doing his initial experiments in the Bristol Channel. And he said, this is doubling at a regular rate, roughly once every 30 months. So this is 2.5 years for this doubling. Will that continue? Well, companies are investing hard to make it happen as well. But what underlies these exponential improvements? Because as futurists, we have to know whether we're just being overconfident or whether there's something genuinely substantial here. And I see three drivers for ongoing exponential improvements. I see first, there has to be physical possibility. There has to be enough space in the atoms, there has to be enough space in the electromagnetic spectrum to do this kind of thing. In the words of Richard Feynman, he observed there's plenty of room at the bottom, way back in 1959. And we've been living that all the way through. So still a long way to go in physical possibilities. But that's not enough. Just because it's physically possible won't mean it happens. You also need to have lots of bright engineers with huge amounts of investment of one sort or another getting involved in actually implementing the next stage. So companies, some of the ones I've mentioned like Broadcom, ARM, Intel, Qualcomm, there are thousands of engineers engaged in working hard to make these kinds of things happen, to keep Moore's Law alive. There are other engineers in companies around the world who are keeping Cooper's Law alive so that there are plenty of enhancements to the wireless spectrum as well. But what's going to make companies keep on making that investment? Because it's more and more money is required every time we step up another generation. And this is the third driver that needs to be in place for this to happen, and it's the ongoing benefits to end users. There must be people willing to pay for these incremental steps up rather than waiting for a long upgrade. So there must be users who say, right, I would like to have a better semiconductor because it will allow me to do better video, or allows me to do better algorithms. It allows me to run new software. So these drivers need to be in place to make it happen in an ongoing way with this positive feedback circle to make it happen. Okay, let's look at another prediction. Now, I've got the picture here of Professor George Church of Harvard, because it's his slides. But I first came across this prediction in the writings of Richard Dawkins. You know, the person who became famous for the selfish gene and the idea of a meme, which we've heard about today. And Richard Dawkins wrote an article in 2002 in a very interesting collection of forecasts about what would happen in 2050. Most of whom are pretty lightweight, but Richard Dawkins I thought was one of the best, and he talked about the son of Moore's Law in that he said, look, there's a gradual improvement in how good we are at sequencing genomes. And if we track that through, eventually, he said, in his prediction, and he was predicting 2050, there will be cheap enough that people could carry around in their pocket something that would sequence enough of their genome to be really useful and really reliable. Now, when George Church drew this chart, he said, well, if you continue the same line of improvement, going at about 1.5 times a year, we would predict actually 2040. Now, that wasn't his actual prediction, but I just wondered, is that what actually happened? How much does it cost to sequence a genome now? What happened is a new, huge set of technologies were developed. We had a bit about CRISPR in one of the earlier talks. A whole bunch of new tools were brought out, and the pace of change got much faster than before. So this is fascinating. It shows that we can't take any of these exponential things as fixed. Often they vary. They vary because of how many technologies can be applied. And what determines often whether technology is applied is how much people are determined to get in there and make some improvement. And the potential upside for medicine is so huge. If we can actually reliably look into people's genome and find out all their personal characteristics, there are so many savings to be made, which is one reason why there were so many more people working on this when it came close enough that people could realize something would happen. This curve has a name as well. I've shown you Moore's Law curve and Cooper's Law curve. This is sometimes called the Carlson curves, after a synthetic biologist in America. He has drawn these the other way around, so you can see the cost per sequencing a single base pair of DNA, and it's come down from more than $10 to a much, much shorter, cheaper rate. And you can see also in this the kink too, this one line and then a second line coming down. So predictions are just extrapolating and dangerous, and sometimes things will happen even faster than we expect. The line in yellow, by the way, isn't for reading DNA. The line in yellow is for improvements in writing DNA. It's when we can actually create new life forms. And that curve is a little bit slower, but it is coming down too. So that was the status in June 2011. And preparing this talk, I looked up the latest Carlson curves. Any idea? There is actually new data. Any idea what's happened next? How would you predict that? Well, it's actually slowed down, strangely, which is an interesting kind of kick for us who think everything is going to go faster. And one reason it's slowed down is, well, there are lots of complexities in here. I mean, it's still pretty cheap, and maybe there aren't so many benefits to be gone by getting much lower. But I just, without going into the details of that particular case, it is fascinating that there's nothing inevitable about this. And those of us in the futurist community who like to think of things as inevitable should take that as an example. One more forecast before I wrap things up. This is one of my favorite forecasts by a leading technologist in the United States who predicted the transformation of the school system. Our school system will be completely changed inside of 10 years. Books will be obsolete in schools. Is that a good prediction? Do you believe in this prediction? It is possible to teach every branch of human knowledge with the motion picture. Now, this was made by somebody with a huge track record of technological development. His name is Thomas Alva Edison, and he made this more than 100 years ago, so he was a bit optimistic. Again, I'm posing the question, well, why wasn't that fulfilled as he hoped? Was he just being naive? So my answer to jumping ahead and skipping along and along analysis, to skip ahead, I think technology, to achieve its real impact, which we're all interested in this room, we all want the technology to liberate us from many of the pains and constraints of society. You need 5 things to happen. So I've talked about the conditions for exponential growth, but that's just for the core technology itself. It's another thing to turn it from the core technology into something that the end population really appreciates. So first of all, there's got to be lots done with that core technology. And it's got to be so good that the end experience is slick and straightforward rather than putting people off. So that's the first condition that needs to take place. And that's what many technologists focus on in terms of, well, the screens are getting better, the semiconductors are faster, we're getting better GPS sensors. That is important, and that is often very hard, but it's only one of 5 things that are important and hard so that technology will achieve its impact. Secondly, as I mentioned, you need to have people turning this technology into real-world applications which people are actually enthusiastic about. And this isn't just applications that appeal to geeks. It's applications that's sometimes described as crossing the chasm into mainstream usage so that people say, yeah, I can get a real benefit from this. And often it takes a long time to do this. And some of the interesting, the genetic enhancements which we have seen took a while to be converted into real-world applications as well. This is where many of us can work. If we are engineers and designers, we can help to translate the power of the core technology into real applications. But it's still more complicated than that, because many times for a technology to live up to its potential, we need to get a broader infrastructure in place. The business environment must be supportive. So I look back at smartphones, the technology area I know best. For smartphones to be really successful, we needed the networks to be good, we also needed the devices to be good, but we also needed the application developers to be excited and get involved in writing it. And some of the existing network infrastructure, they weren't actually that keen on having lots of applications running on their networks, and they were quite resistant to it. And this is often the case. As we heard earlier, yesterday in Mark Stevenson's talk, he explained about the way in which often it's not the established corporations that will lead to the innovations. And Instagram was not invented by a huge photography company, and so forth. So often the existing infrastructure is against these changes because in the short term, at least, it's going to be bad news for them. So if we really, some examples, I mentioned the application stores. If we're looking at the example of electric cars, we don't just need the cars, we need to put the whole system in place for battery charging. There are lots more examples. And sometimes that business environment, which doesn't like what's happening, gets support from legislation. And unless we have the legal framework sufficiently supportive in terms of not just the legislation, but also where the government is putting its subsidies, that can also slow things down dramatically. So we have to campaign, as was said earlier, we have to get people, as Callum made in his presentation, we have to raise the public clamour so that the government is more in tune to doing the changes in the legislation, the changing in funding, the changes in subsidies that will make these desirable technologies happen. And last but not least, we need to get these prevailing philosophies changed, the zeitgeist alteration, setting user expectations broadly so that people are keen to really achieve the best we can do. So if I summarize, to overcome the roadblocks ahead, and there are plenty, as I've mentioned, in terms of achieving success, we have to get more and more people bought into this vision of a better humanity ahead rather than trying to hold on to the past in a way that's impossible because of all the changes. So let's make that humanity plus, that transhumanism and value set more widely shared. And to do that, as we've heard in this conference, is not just enough to talk about the science, we have to engage the whole brain, whether it's art, whether it's videos, whether it's a Hollywood, whether it's TV series, whether it's magazine articles, to get people excited. And this will get more of the culture on our side. How were many social changes done in the world? They were done by influencing the storylines of popular soap operas on TV. So let's get in that conversation running as well. It will help if we have personable spokespersons. I heard this morning, the first talk, we should avoid being too weird, because weird's okay for the initial geeks, but we need to have people like me. That's what people should think, representing this potential vision. And we need to be clear and reliable, and I think this is my own personal contribution. I wish after this conference to run on ahead more clearly with something which I provisionally call London Futurist Academy, which is a reliable source of information which will separate out the kind of weird and untrustworthy information about the future from something which is much more solid. So if anybody's interested in Futurism 101, there'll be a reliable place to come. That should highlight the problems that most need solution and can demonstrate step by step. And I'm a very big fan of a roadmap of changes, not just a big vision at the end, but step by step what changes can be put in place to make this happen. And if we do all that, we will accelerate the technologies of abundance, and we will be able to have enough technology and abundance around that can make the existing crises fall away, and we will be in a much better society. We will have engineered a new society by technology, but also by letting our best human values come to the core. Thank you very much.
Can you walk up with Thank you, David. Any questions from the audience? Yes, in the middle here.
David, building a little bit on the sentiment actually from yesterday as well. I've heard a comment, I don't remember who the speaker was, but so we focused a little bit more on strategy rather than logistics in all our discussions about the future. And so my question, and today we were talking about the cooperation and collaboration, and you also mentioned that. Yesterday we also mentioned it's not so many futurists actually in the world. And I noticed that the format of most of the conferences or meetings or gatherings is more splurging the ideas, but not really going anywhere further than that. So what can we do, for example, to collaborate more and maybe bring some people who are better at logistics and better at putting some discipline for us to collaborate?
So I'm a big, big fan of, my word is execution. If I see why do companies succeed or fail in times of rapid change, there's certainly the marketing angle, which I've talked about. But you also need the roadmap, which is step by step how it's going to grow and tap into the broader ecosystem of potential supporters. But companies often fail because of weakness in execution. Weakness in execution means they're stuck in their rut. And the three things I point to inside that execution framework are: one, agile, which Paul was talking about yesterday; lean, which means avoiding the processes getting too big; and third, a technical thing called continuous integration, which means that you're ready, continually making new versions, pulling together the best insights. That's the broad structure. Now, we don't talk about all of that first of all. There's various phases in this. One of them is indeed making people interested, showing the vision. But then as they come, we have to be able to point, as I said here, to incremental steps in a roadmap of actual projects in which people can get involved. And so the Humanity Plus organization is in the process of rolling out a series of projects in which people can get involved, not just a kind of a big vision, but how we can step by step make a difference. And I think some of the stuff with video this morning shows an example of what we could like to do. It's something that's almost in a different level from what we've achieved before. And to do that, we will need good business collaboration skills as well as the vision. And so I'm very pleased when I look at the profiles of the people in the room. There are many people who've got practical business skills. And I'm hoping that some of us will be able to cooperate more in some of these projects.
Is there another question? Yes, down here. Paul, and then. Paul was first and then Miss Jen. Oh, either way. Oh, this is
David,
what's wrong with this name tag?
where in your list of 5 things do you think there is scope for stopping bad ideas, or to identify things which aren't going to achieve an impact and stop wasting time on them?
Well, often you can't know in advance whether an idea is going to work or not. So you do need this agility process. Agility means that you try a bit of an experiment and you see early on whether it's going to succeed or fail. Business people have a phrase called fail fast. Not that you want to fail, but if you are going to fail, you better find out quickly whether it's going to work or not. So I'm in favor of trying multiple things. I would not want to see a worldwide single futurist organization which dictates this is the only way you can do things. You need to have multiple organizations, and likewise multiple transhumanist movements as well. So let's have that experimentation there.
Hi, David. I'd like to ask you to think about your last comment, which was bringing out the best in human values with some of the things you mentioned, for example, sensor technology. And in Mark's talk yesterday morning, he enthused about the Fitbit. I've recently been given one, read the end-user license agreement, and found that all of my personal data irrevocably becomes the property of Fitbit.com or whatever company it is. How do you balance the human values you're talking about with the fact that most of this technology is being orchestrated by a few large companies who you might say don't have human values at the forefront? They instead have the profit motive. And how do you reconcile those two elements? Would you wear a Fitbit knowing that literally all of your health data is going to a third-party company, or would you have sex with a robot, as David Levy was saying, knowing that every bit of sensor technology in that robot is going to streaming to a third-party company?
So the first answer is, of course, we must discuss what we find out and share. So the fact that Fitbit has a particular user license should be widely discussed. And maybe other companies will come with a slightly different approach. But more broadly, the question is, can we just leave it to corporations who will be pursuing, other things being equal, they will be pursuing the profit motive to succeed? Is that the best way forwards, you know? And some people are afraid that one kind of new organism will come on this world, which is artificially intelligent organism, and it won't be friendly to humans. There is already such organisms in the world, and they are corporations, and they've got their own motivations. And can we make these corporations friendly enough to humans? Well, it comes down to values, you know? And once upon a time, many business people, they weren't just motivated by making money. They had their own religious sentiment, you know. They were there for service, and they wanted to make money, but they also wanted to serve in a broad sense. Now, many of the traditional religions have lost their force for all kinds of reasons. You know, we look at their holy books, and they don't make sense to us in the modern world. But I would like more philosophy to come, an emergence of this positive humanity plus philosophy, so that more people will be like some of the corporations. Now, not every corporation is just dominated by making money. We can have mixed views about Google, but I think they're not all just trying to make huge amounts of money in the short term, you know? And likewise, some of the other corporations, the goal has been to actually genuinely share information. Now, of course, in part, they are driven by financial motivations too. We can't get away from that. And to counteract that, I think we also need a little bit of government legislation. And it's not a popular idea, and some people don't like government legislation, but I think the only entities big enough to stop corporations just getting bigger and bigger in their own rights is laws from governments, and that will require some cooperation worldwide to stop them. And that's why I'm a fan of at least some amount of coordinated international action on these topics.
Thank you.
Yeah.